This Day in Sports History. This episode is brought to you by the Sterling Soap Company. I'm a big fan of shave soap. I've been using different brands for years, and I recently gave Sterling's shave soaps a try, and I've been very happy with the results. Sterling's shave soaps give you a great lather and a frictionless feel that allows the razor to glide right over the skin for a super close shave. No skin irritation and a clean, refreshing feel with no soapy residue after. I can tell you without a doubt, it's simply the best shave I've ever had. And my wife has noticed too. And here's the thing. With the ability to purchase 1-ounce sample pucks, you can try out different scents to find the right one for you. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com. That's STIRLING soap.com. It's January 7th, and on this day in 1980, the Philadelphia Flyers lost for the first time in 86 days. On October 13, 1979, the Flyers lost in the second game of the 1979-80 season in a 9-2 drubbing to the Atlanta Flames. From that point until this day in 1980, the Flyers did not lose a single game. During that span, they won 25 and tied 10. The Flyers had a good mix of veterans and young talent that season, and during the streak, they got clutch goaltending performances from Phil Meir and Pete Peters. Bobby Clarke was the heart and soul of that team and was literally a coach on the ice. He'd been promoted to assistant coach while still playing for the team, and he had to give up the C on his sweater due to league rules. Here's Clarke remembering that streak years later.
I think we just play them one night at a time, and when you go that long without getting beat, you got to get lucky lots of times.
There were several close calls along the way. A few nights before they broke the NHL unbeaten record, the Flyers were playing at home against Pittsburgh. Philly trailed 1-0 late in the third. With just over 4 minutes to play in that game, Ben Wilson found the back of the net to tie it up and keep the unbeaten streak alive. And that actually tied the previous record of 28 games, set just 2 years before by the '78 Montreal Canadiens. 2 nights later, they were in Boston and they cruised to a 5-2 win over the Bruins to break the record, and they continued to build on it until this night. Playing on the road at Minnesota, the North Stars took a 3-1 lead into the first intermission, added 2 more in the second, and another pair of goals in the third to beat the Flyers 7-1, and end the unbeaten streak at 35 games. It is the longest unbeaten streak in professional sports. The Flyers wrapped up the division and number 1 playoff seed with 14 games to play in the regular season. They exacted a little bit of revenge on the North Stars by bouncing them in the playoffs to advance to the Stanley Cup Finals, but they came up just a little bit short and lost in 6 games to the New York Islanders. So we've talked about the crazy 2007 college football season since September 1st, and it truly was one of the wildest years in college football. Of course, it started with Appalachian State's upset of Michigan on September 1st, 2007, followed by all the number 1 and number 2 teams that lost along the way that kept the drama flowing. The top 2 teams had not lost on the same weekend since 1996, and yet on 3 different weekends in the '07 season, numbers 1 and 2 both went down. 7 times during the final 2 months of the season, the team that sat number 2 lost. 17 different teams had been ranked in the top 5. Well, the year of the upset finally came to an end on this night in 2008, when number 1 Ohio State and number 2 LSU met in New Orleans for the national championship. This matchup was a bit of a surprise. At the beginning of December, people thought they'd be watching West Virginia and Missouri in this one. Instead, both of those teams went down in flames in their respective conference championship games. Despite having 2 losses, the Tigers were actually 5.5-point favorites in this one. But of course, the game didn't follow that script, at least from the start. The starting lineups had barely been introduced on television when Chris "Beanie" Wells bolted for the end zone. Calling the action that night for Fox was Tom Brenneman and Charles Davis.
Wells, a big burst to the outside. Beanie Wells to the 30, the 20, Lunge for a tackle. Touchdown, Buckeyes, 65 yards.
It was 10-3 Buckeyes at the end of one, and that's when LSU started to get cranking. The Tigers put a couple of touchdowns on the board to take a 7-point lead, and then they squelched a Buckeye drive on this play.
And they're coming after Beckman, who lost it to the far side, and it is intercepted by Shevis Jackson to the 30, the 25, and run out of bounds.
That was the first of 2 interceptions for Todd Beckman on the night. LSU was able to capitalize on the mistake with a Jacob Hester 1-yard touchdown run. The Tigers scored 24 unanswered to take a 24-10 lead into halftime. The teams exchanged touchdowns in the third quarter, and then LSU put the proverbial nail in the coffin with under 2 to play.
Flynn rolls wide open as Dixon.
That was Matt Flynn's 4th touchdown pass of the night. Flynn completed 19 for 174 yards. The Buckeyes scored quickly on their next possession to tighten up the margin a little bit. But when the clock went to triple zeros, the LSU Tigers won 38-24, becoming the first 2-loss team to win a championship since 1960. And it was the Tigers' first national title since 1958. Have you ever been to a Harlem Globetrotters game? Even if you have not, you surely know about them and the fun shows they have been putting on for kids of all ages for many generations. Well, the Harlem Globetrotters played their first ever basketball game on this day in 1927. The first thing to know, though, is they are not a team from New York. Chicago's Abe Saperstein took over as coach of a group of black Chicago players who had previously played for a team known as the Savoy Big Five. Black players were not allowed to play in a professional basketball league at the time, and they would not for another 23 years. To better market the team, Saperstein made the decision to name them after the famous black neighborhood in New York, and even sewed New York on the team's red, white, and blue jerseys. And the group became a barnstorming team that would travel around in the Midwest playing games. On this night, they traveled the 50 miles from Chicago to Hinckley, Illinois. They lost on this night, but over a 117-game schedule that year, they won 101 of them against a variety of competition. Now, this was not the entertaining group that you see now. They weren't doing the crazy dribbling and the bucket of confetti or clowning around with a ref. This was a team that got paid to play basketball and play to win. The reported pay for this night was $75, and that's not per player, that's $75 total for the 5 players. One of the guys on the team was Al Runt Pullins, who was by all accounts a star player who also owned a car, so the guys could get from town to town to play the games. Saperstein said many years later that Pullins was the best player he ever coached. By 1936, they were playing upwards of 1,000 games a year, and it wasn't until 1939 that the Harlem Globetrotters you know today started to really take shape. Once the team had a large enough lead, the players were allowed to show off some of their skills to the crowd, and they started performing a few on-court comedic pieces. The crowds overwhelmingly loved the performance, and Saperstein encouraged more of it, but again, only when they had a substantial lead. They've played all around the world now and delighted fans for nearly 100 years, and they got their start on this day in 1927. And on this day in 1991, baseball's Pete Rose was released from federal prison after spending 5 months for income tax evasion. This wrapped up phase 1 of his rehabilitation. He'd been convicted of failing to report $350,000 from memorabilia and autographs at baseball card shows. At this point, Pete had to check into a Cincinnati halfway house for the next 3 months, where he was ordered to perform 1,000 hours of community service. A 9-month probationary period followed that. And time now for today's That Ain't Got Nothing to Do with Sports Fun Fact. In 1974, the Gerber Baby Food Company briefly put out a new product line of jarred food intended for single adults on the go.
Say what?
You could choose from beef burgundy, Mediterranean vegetables, and blueberry delight. And all you needed to do was heat up the jar and eat.
What did you say?
But the idea of eating pureed food out of a jar thankfully failed to catch on with people over the age of, 6? Hey, this is Steve White, the host of This Day in Sports History. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the episode or you're a fan of the podcast, can I ask you to do me a favor? I made the shortlist for the Best Sports Talk Podcast in 2024. There are some well-known folks in this category, such as the Kelsey brothers, Scott Van Pelt, Bill Roden, and I can use all the help that I can get. I put a link in the show notes that will take you to the page, and if you have a moment, click that link and cast your vote for my podcast. I would certainly appreciate it. Thanks to all of those who have voted, and again, thanks for listening. Have a great day. I'll talk to you tomorrow. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.
Hey there, sports history fans. We've got some exciting news to share with you. 6 of our podcasts from the Sports History Network have made it to the final round of voting for the prestigious Sports Podcast Awards. Here are their shows and the categories. Historically Speaking Sports and This Day in Sports History are both competing for Best Sports Talk Podcast. No Nonsense Old School Weightlifting History is in the running for Best Fitness, Health, and Wellbeing Podcast. When Football Was Football is up for Best Sports Documentary Podcast. Wrestling with Heels On has entered the ring for Best Wrestling Podcast. And Shoulder Roll Virtual Boxing is fighting for the title for Best Combat Sports Podcast. Now, of course, we need your help to take home the championship for each of these awesome shows. All you gotta do is head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/vote and cast your vote for your favorite shows, or better yet, all 6 of them. Again, every vote counts, and we gotta show the world how much sports history really matters. So thank you for your support and making Sports History Network the headquarters for sports yesteryear. But again, don't wait. You gotta go vote now. That's over at sportshistorynetwork.com/vote.